The sound of my son's voice on the phone that night, I still hear it. Not words, really. Just this sharp intake of breath, like he was trying to hold something in, and then nothing. Silence that lasted too long. I was 40 minutes away when my wife called. She said there'd been an incident. That's the word she used, incident, like it was a fender bender or a broken window. I asked where our son was and she said the hospital, and I don't remember the drive at all. I remember parking crooked across 2 spots, and I remember the smell of the ER, antiseptic and old coffee, and I remember seeing my boy Liam, 16 years old, lying in a bed with both legs in casts and bruising already turning purple across his shins. And I remember thinking, this doesn't happen by falling off a bike. The attending physician told me both tibias were fractured. The left one, clean through. There was bruising consistent with blunt force trauma to the knees. She said it carefully, the way doctors do when they know the answer but aren't the ones who get to say it out loud. I turned to my wife. She was standing near the curtain, arms folded, not looking at Liam. And I asked her what happened. She said he fell down the embankment near the park. I looked at my son. He was staring at the ceiling. He wouldn't look at me. I spent 12 years doing work I can't fully describe. Not to most people. What I can say is that I was attached to a federal unit that handled operations in places where the rules of engagement were more of a suggestion than a policy. I've sat across from men who had rehearsed their lies for days, and I've known within 90 seconds exactly where the story fell apart. My son is not a practiced liar. He's 16. He still blinks too fast when he's not telling the truth. I pulled a chair next to his bed, and I sat down and I kept my voice very calm, and I said, Liam, I need you to tell me what really happened. He looked at my wife first. That's what I noticed. He looked at her before he looked at me, and something in my chest went cold. He said he fell. I didn't push it that night. I sat with him until he fell asleep, and then I stepped into the hallway, and I asked my wife to walk with me toward the vending machines. Away from the nurse's station, away from anyone who might be listening. And I asked her again, quietly, without any edge in my voice, because I've learned that the edge makes people shut down. She said she'd already talked to someone about it, that it was being handled, that I should let it go. I said, who did you talk to? She said, a friend. She wasn't going to say more. I could see it in the way her jaw said. So I nodded, and I went back to sit with Liam, and I let her think I was going to let it go. I wasn't going to let it go. I wasn't going to let it go. The next morning, while my wife took Liam to a follow-up imaging appointment, I drove back to the park near our neighborhood. The embankment she'd described doesn't exist. There's a slight slope near the east fence, maybe 4 feet of gentle grade down to a drainage ditch. A healthy 10-year-old couldn't fracture both legs falling down that slope. I walked the perimeter. I talked to a woman who walked her dog there every morning. She hadn't seen anything. I drove to the gas station 2 blocks over and asked if I could look at their external camera footage from the night before. The attendant was a kid in his early 20s. He said, sure, no problem. The camera caught the corner of the park entrance. There was a patrol car parked there for 47 minutes starting at 7:14 p.m. That was around the time Liam's phone had gone dark. I'd checked. I wrote down the car's unit number from the footage and I sat in my truck for a while. My wife had said, a friend. She'd been making calls I didn't recognize on her cell phone for about 3 weeks. I hadn't said anything because I'd assumed work, stress, something I'd deal with later. I'm not proud of that assumption. I should have paid closer attention earlier. I drove home and I opened my laptop and I pulled up public records, complaints filed with the county sheriff's department, civil filings in the last 18 months, anything that touched the unit number I'd written down. It took me about 2 hours to find a name. Deputy Sheriff Grant Holloway, 12-year veteran. 3 internal affairs complaints, all closed without findings. A civil suit that had been settled quietly in 2022 involving an altercation with a minor outside a convenience store. I read that last one 3 times. I have a friend, I'll call him Reeves, who works in a field adjacent to mine. We don't talk often. When we do, we don't use our regular phones. I reached out to him the old way and told him I needed background on a name. He called me back in 4 hours. Grant Holloway came from a family with deep roots in the county. His uncle had served 2 terms as a city alderman. His captain, a man named Sutter, had gone to the same high school as Holloway's father, and they'd known each other for 30 years. Holloway had been cited twice for excessive force. Both times walked back after witness statements changed. One witness had moved out of state within 60 days of recanting. The other had been arrested on an unrelated drug charge 2 weeks after changing his story. Reeves told me to be careful. He used that word specifically, careful, not cautious. careful. There's a difference. Cautious means you're protecting yourself. Careful means you understand the thing you're dealing with. I told him I understood. He said, I know you do. That's why I'm saying it. The hardest part of this, the part I didn't know how to hold, wasn't Holloway. Men like Holloway I've dealt with my entire adult life. The part that sat wrong was my wife. Her name is Diane. We met when I was 26, just back from my first deployment that I could never fully explain. She was patient with that. She was patient with a lot. We built something that I thought was solid. We had Liam, and then 3 years later we had our daughter, Nora. Nora is 13. She was at a sleepover the night this happened. She doesn't know the details of what was done to her brother. I've kept it that way deliberately. What I came to understand over the week after Liam's injury was that Diane had been seeing Holloway for somewhere between 4 and 6 months. I didn't arrive at this by confronting her. I arrived at it by paying attention, the kind of attention I was trained to pay. Small things. The timing of her phone calls. The way she tensed when his name came up on the news scanner I kept on in the kitchen. A receipt I found for a restaurant in a town 40 minutes away that she told me she'd never been to. When I finally had enough to know for certain, I sat with it for 2 days before I said a word to anyone. On the third day, I asked Diane to sit down with me at the kitchen table after the kids were in bed. I made coffee. I set a mug in front of her. And I said, I know about Grant Holloway. She didn't deny it. That surprised me. I expected her to. Instead, she looked at her coffee for a long moment, and then she said, He told me it was necessary. That Liam had been disrespectful. I didn't say anything, she said. He said if we made it into a thing, it would get worse. I said, What did you do, Diane? She didn't answer. I said, Did you tell him we wouldn't say anything? She started to cry. Not dramatic crying, just quiet tears, sitting there with her hands around the mug. She said, I didn't know how bad it was until I got there. I pushed my chair back from the table. I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of our bed in the dark for a long time. I'm not a man who loses control. That's not pride. It's just something that was conditioned out of me over years. But I want to be honest about what that night felt like, because I think there's a version of this story that skips over it, that jumps from discovery to action, and that's not honest. What I felt sitting on that bed was grief, not anger. Grief. For Liam. For whatever my marriage actually was. For the version of my life I'd believed in. I let myself feel that for about an hour. Then I made a list. There are things you can do through proper channels. And there are things proper channels are designed to prevent you from doing. I've operated in both worlds. I knew that filing a formal complaint with the sheriff's department would go to Sutter, who would send it to Internal Affairs, where it would be reviewed by people who had known Holloway's family for 2 decades. I knew what under review meant in a structure like that. It meant buried. So I worked the other side. I reached out to a former colleague who now works in digital forensics. Contract work, nothing official. He owed me a favor from something I'll never be able to put in writing. I asked him to help me pull deleted communication records from a backup service Holloway used. It took him 9 days. What he found was a series of messages between Holloway and Diane spanning 5 months, and within those messages, 3 exchanges that were relevant to Liam. The first was a voice message Holloway had left that Diane had saved without realizing the backup was syncing. He'd said, and I'm paraphrasing because the exact words matter less than what they meant, that he'd had a conversation with Liam that Liam needed to remember. That if I decided to be a problem, there were things he could make happen. That Diane should keep me calm. The second was a text from Diane asking if Liam would be okay. Holloway had responded, relax, nothing permanent. The third was a transfer confirmation. Diane had sent $2,400 to a Venmo account registered to a name I didn't recognize, but which my forensics contact traced to a prepaid card used by someone in Holloway's precinct. I still don't know exactly what that payment was for. I have a few theories. I don't think any of them are good. I made contact with a federal investigator I'd worked with years ago, a man named Aldrich Burgess, now with the DOJ. I didn't go to him as a civilian asking for help. I went to him as a former colleague, sharing information I thought was relevant to patterns he might already be aware of. That's a distinction that matters, procedurally. Aldrich had heard Holloway's name before. Not directly, but the county had been on a low-level watch list related to civil rights violations for about 14 months. He said what I had was potentially useful. He said he'd need it documented properly. He said, very carefully, that he could not direct me to do anything, but that if documentation were to exist and were to come to his attention through appropriate means, it would be taken seriously. I told him I understood. Over the following 3 weeks, I built a file. Not just the digital records, I found 2 other families in the county who had encounters with Holloway that had never been formally reported. One family, the Avrares, had a son who'd been roughed up at a park 2 years earlier and told not to say anything. They hadn't, because they were afraid. When I sat at their kitchen table and told them what had happened to Liam, the father looked at his wife for a long time and then said he was ready to talk. The second family had moved. I found them through school records. Their daughter had transferred schools abruptly in fall of the previous year after an incident that was logged only as behavioral in the system. It took me a while to reach them. When I did, the mother said she'd been waiting for someone to call. She'd kept everything. 3 families, documented incidents spanning roughly 30 months, a pattern of behavior targeting minors with a clear mechanism of intimidation and financial pressure. I handed everything to Aldrich through channels I won't specify. What happened next took 4 months. I know that sounds long. It felt longer. During those 4 months, I had to continue living in a house with a woman I no longer recognized, maintaining enough surface normalcy that the kids didn't feel the fracture running through everything. Liam's legs healed. He walked with a slight limp for a while, then didn't. He's a quiet kid by nature, and he got quieter. I got him into therapy without making it a production. The therapist was good. She had a way of making it feel like just talking. Nora noticed something was wrong. She's perceptive in ways that Liam isn't. Different kind of intelligence. She asked me one evening if I was okay, and I told her I was working through something and that it wasn't about her and that I loved her. She accepted that. Kids are more resilient than we give them credit for, and also more fragile than we want to admit. Both things are true. Diane and I didn't talk much. She slept in the guest room. She apologized twice, both times in ways that felt like she was apologizing for her own discomfort rather than for what had happened to Liam. I didn't respond to either apology with anything meaningful. I wasn't ready. Holloway was arrested on a Tuesday morning, early, outside a diner where he had breakfast 3 days a week. That detail came out later, his routine. He was taken in a way that was quiet and deliberate. No spectacle, no parking lot crowd. Federal charges, civil rights violations, conspiracy, and several counts related to the financial irregularities in his department that investigators had uncovered once they started pulling the thread I'd given them. Captain Sutter was placed on administrative leave the same day. He resigned 4 days later. There were other names in the filing that I hadn't known. The investigation had gone places I hadn't directed it. That's the thing about opening a door. You don't always know what's on the other side, or how many rooms connect. The Wyborough family called me the night the news broke. The father just said thank you, and it didn't say anything else for a moment. I told him he'd done the hard part by being willing to speak up. He said his son had watched the news with him that night and hadn't said anything but had put his arm around him on the couch. He sounded like he was trying not to cry. I told him I was glad. Diane was interviewed by investigators. She was honest in those interviews, more honest than I expected. I think she understood by then that the story was larger than she'd known when she was inside it, and that the only real choice left was to be truthful. She was not charged criminally. There was some question about the wire transfer, but the arrangement was characterized ultimately as coercion. That Holloway had pressured her into it with implicit threats about what he could do to our family if she didn't comply. I have complicated feelings about that characterization. I think it's partially true. I also think she made choices over months that led to a room she didn't fully understand until Liam was already in the hospital. She moved out in the spring. We're going through the process now, cleanly and without fighting. The house goes on the market next month. The kids are handling it about as well as you'd expect, and also about as hard as you'd expect. Which is to say, some days are fine and some days aren't, and I just try to show up to both kinds. There's a moment from those 4 months that I keep coming back to. I was sitting in my truck outside the county records office. I'd gone to pick up a document, something routine, and I just sat there for a while before going in. It was November. The light that time of year in this part of the country is thin and pale, and it makes everything look a little washed out. I was thinking about the version of my life I thought I was living 12 months before. Ordinary things. Weekend projects. Liam's soccer games. Nora's school play I'd almost missed because of work. I'm not someone who spends a lot of time asking why things happen. That's not a useful question in my experience. But I sat in that truck for maybe 20 minutes just letting myself feel the distance between that life and this one. Then I got out and went inside and did what needed to be done. That's mostly what this whole thing was. A long series of getting out of the truck. Holloway pled guilty to 4 of the 7 charges. He's serving time. The civil suit, filed by the Ibarra family and by me separately, is ongoing. I'm not doing it for the money. I'm doing it because a civil record is public in a way. A federal plea isn't. And I want there to be a document that anyone can find that says clearly what he did and what it cost. The county has a new oversight board now. 2 of the 3 members were appointed after pressure from a coalition of families in the area, including ours. I went to one of the board meetings. I sat in the back. I didn't speak. I just wanted to see it. Liam is doing better. He went back to school in January. Last month he signed up for a photography elective, which I didn't know he was interested in. He showed me some of his pictures. Stuff he'd taken around our neighborhood, close-ups of ordinary things, textures on a fence, shadow patterns on pavement. He has a good eye. I told him that and he half smiled the way he does and went back to his phone, but I could tell it landed. Nora asks about the future sometimes. Where will we live? Will things be okay? I tell her yes, things will be okay. I tell her yes, things will be okay, and I mean it, which matters. She can tell when I don't mean something. I've gotten better at distinguishing what I know from what I'm hoping, and at being honest with her about which one is which. I don't know exactly what kind of man I am now on the other side of this. I know what I was trained to be. I know what I tried to be as a father and as a husband. I know some of where those things succeeded and exactly where they failed. What I know for certain is that when my son needed someone to not let it go, I didn't let it go. In the end, I think that's the thing he needed to see most. Not justice, exactly. Not even the arrest. Just that when something is done to you that shouldn't be done to you, there are people who will not look away from it. I hope he carries that. I hope it's worth more to him than the damage. I think it will be. I have to believe that. I've thought a lot about what actually started all of this. Not the night Liam ended up in the ER, that was just when I found out. It started earlier, in choices. Small ones, made over months, by people who told themselves each one didn't really matter. Holloway didn't wake up one morning and decide to be the kind of man who breaks a teenager's legs and laughs about it. He got there one step at a time. A complaint that was walked back. A witness who moved away. A captain who looked the other way because they'd known each other since high school. Every time something should have stopped him and didn't, he learned something, that there was no cost, that the structure around him would absorb whatever he did. That's not a personality flaw. That's a lesson, taught over years, by a system that kept passing him through. And Diane, I spent a long time trying to understand the choices she made. I don't think she's a bad person in the way that phrase usually means. I think she made a series of decisions, each one feeling small in the moment, and she didn't look far enough ahead to see where they were leading. That's a different kind of failure than malice, but it's still a failure. Understanding it doesn't make it less real for Liam. He still has the memory. He still went quiet in ways I'm still watching for. What I keep coming back to is this. The thing that made the difference wasn't strength in the physical sense. I have that kind of training, yes. But that's not what this took. What it took was the willingness to stay clear-headed when everything in me wanted to react, to be precise when I was grieving. To follow the thread even when I wasn't sure where it would go. That's not a special forces skill. That's just what happens when you refuse to let pain make the decisions for you. I think about the Wibera family a lot. Their son was hurt 2 years before Liam. They stayed quiet because they were afraid, and I don't blame them for that. Fear in that situation is rational. But the silence had a cost. It gave Holloway 2 more years of the same lesson. No consequences. When they finally decided to speak, it wasn't because things got easier. It was because someone sat across from them and told them they weren't alone. That's what changed the math. Liam showed me his photographs last week. Close-up stuff. Textures, shadows, the way light hits a chain-link fence at a certain angle. There's something in the way he sees things now that feels more careful than before, more deliberate. I don't know what to make of that entirely. I hope it means he's paying better attention to the world. I hope it doesn't mean he's learned to keep his distance from it. What I want him to understand. What I want Nora to understand too. Someday when she's old enough for the full version of this story, is that integrity isn't what you do when it's easy. It's what you do when it costs something. When Holloway and the people around him chose convenience over accountability, it compounded. Each small choice made the next one easier. When the Ibaras chose to speak up despite being afraid, that also compounded. into something that ended up mattering for families they'd never met. Actions move forward. They don't stay where you leave them. That's not a philosophy I borrowed from anyone. It's just what I've watched happen in this work and in this life enough times to believe it.